Limbus company's latest update has added an identity that completes the fraud duo of Kanto 8. This time it's just one's turn to become an ID, and Ryoshu is the sinner receiving it. N Corp Ego Contempt or Ryoshu, or just N Corp Ryoshu, is our newest Tremor Bleed hybrid identity, combining the two statuses with unique effects of her own, as well as high damage and the unique synergy with Fell Bullet Yi-sang. The kit of this unit is quite multifaceted, with her performing different roles in different teams and different types of encounters. But is she powerful? And is she worth getting? In today's video I aim to talk about exactly that. We'll conduct an analysis of N Corp Ryoshu by first looking at her kit and then talking about her performance in Bleed and Tremor, finishing off with her power in a duo with N Corp Yi-sang. But before we start, I have to remind you guys that most of my viewers are not subscribed. So if you find yourself coming back to my videos or end up enjoying this one, consider subscribing, it helps me out a lot. Without further ado, let's get back to Ryoshu. We'll start with the new Identities kit. N Corp Ryoshu has 200 health, high speed and a low defense level. Her sin affinity spread consists of Envy, Wrath and Lust, with a Sloth defense. All of her skills get coin power from the sum of Bleed and Tremor on the target. Her skill 1 clashes it up to 16, gains clash power against enemies with Gaze or Contempt, inflicts Bleed and Tremor count and also inflicts 1 Gaze. Her skill 2 clashes it up to 21, and grants clash power against enemies with Gaze or Contempt. Its coins inflict 2 Tremor, 2 Bleed, 1 Tremor count and 1 Bleed count, as well as 2 Gaze. The second coin triggers Tremor Burst if the enemy is at 3 Tremor count or more. Her skill 3 comes in 2 flavors. Awe Contempt is the base form and it rolls up to 23, inflicts extra potency against enemies with Gaze and deals extra damage based on Bleed and Tremor on target. The coins of the skill inflict Tremor and Bleed, potency and count, and the third coin is Unbreakable, deals extra damage based on Gaze on target, inflicts 3 Gaze, and on hit without cracking, it converts Tremor on the enemy into Tremor Hemorrhage, after which it bursts Tremor on the enemy once. If the skill 3 is used at 7 plus total Gaze, or at least 1 Contempt on the enemy team, skill 3-2 gets activated instead. This skill has 1 coin, rolls up to 32 and gets 3 base attack weight. It cannot be reused through any outside means. The skill prioritizes enemies with Contempt or Gaze, but deals only half damage to the sub-targets. If there's only one enemy, the skill deals 200% more damage. It deals extra damage based on Bleed and Tremor on the main target, as well as Gaze on all attack targets. After attack, Gaze and Contempt on all targets are consumed. The coin of the skill deals 235% more damage if the enemy has Contempt, inflicts 4 Tremor and Bleed, as well as 2 Tremor and Bleed count, converts the Tremor on enemy into Hemorrhage, and triggers Tremor Burst once. As for Ryoshu's defensive skill, she gets a guard. At combat start, if Ryoshu does not have Contempt of the Gaze, and if the enemy team is inflicted with at least 7 Gaze or 1 Contempt, she gets Contempt of the Gaze. On use, the guard gets 10 final power if Ryoshu has Contempt of the Gaze, and when Ryoshu is hit with the skill up, she inflicts 1 bleed count against the attacker, up to 3 times per turn. As for her passives, Ryoshu gets 3. The first passive grants Ryoshu 4 protection when she is staggered, and also applies Contempt of the Gaze to her on the next turn. On death, Ryoshu inflicts 2 bind, 2 bleed and 1 bleed count, and 2 tremor and 1 tremor count against 3 enemies with the most gaze or contempt, in descending order. The second passive defines Ryoshu's synergy with Fell Bullet Yisung. At combat start, Yisung's skill 3 gains the following effects. Before using the skill, if Ryoshu has Contempt of the Gaze and she isn't staggered, Yisung uses I Shall Fire anytime against Ryoshu. That skill is technically N Corp Yisung's skill 4, and we'll get to it later. Also, before using Yisung's skill 3, if the target is not Ryoshu and she isn't staggered, she hits that skill's main target with an unopposed skill 1. This attack can hit allies, deals 50% less damage and cannot kill the target. Ryoshu's third passive requires 2 Last Resonance and allows her to inflict 2 gaze on hit, once per enemy per turn. If she has Gaze of Contempt, the effect inflicts 1 more gaze. When Ryoshu is hit by an enemy, she inflicts 1 gaze against the attacker, once per skill, 3 times per turn. If Ryoshu has Contempt of the Gaze, she also reflects 20% of damage dealt by the attacker's final coin as sloth damage, up to 20 damage per skill, 60 per turn. If Ryoshu consumed Gaze or Contempt on the enemy, she gets Gaze of Contempt next turn, based on the amount of effects consumed, up to 6. As for Ryoshu's support passive, it requires 3 Last Resonance, and allows the earliest deployed ally to inflict 1 bleed when hitting an enemy. If the enemy already has bleed, the ally also inflicts 1 bleed count. Additionally, the same effect applies to Tremor, but requires the ally to get hit and can be procced up to 3 times per turn. Before moving on to Ryoshu in combat, let's look at the unique effects she works with. Gaze stacks up to 7 and makes the inflicted enemy deal and take 10% more damage per stack when interacting with Ryoshu specifically. On death, this effect transfers to another enemy without or with the least Gaze of Contempt. At turn end, if there are 7 stacks of the effect, it's converted to Contempt. Contempt only stacks to 1 and makes the inflicted enemy take and deal 50% less damage to and from Ryoshu specifically. Targets with this effect cannot gain Gaze. On death, it transfers much like Gaze, and at turn end, the effect expires and turns into 7 stacks of Gaze next turn. Tremor Hemorrhage is our newest Tremor type, and this one is pretty much Scorch but for bleed. On Tremor Burst, the effect deals last damage equal to half the sum of Tremor and Bleed on target, and lowers the bleed count by 1. Other than this, it's just normal Tremor. The other effects Ryoshu works with are Gaze of Contempt and Contempt of the Gaze, but both of them are not new and are tied to the Contempt or Ego skill. Which means we can finally move on to Ryoshu in combat, and we'll start with her performance in the Bleed team. In that team, Ryoshu can pride herself on good physical damage, not incredible but existing bleed infliction and access to AoE. That description reminds me of someone, but Ryoshu is actually quite unique. In combat, what you want to do, first and foremost, is to stack Gaze. Stacking up the effect quickly is the key to actually making the unit do good damage. In order to do that, you will need to make sure to always have a 2-skill Last Resonance going on, which activates Ryoshu's passive. With her passive up, Ryoshu can hit 7 stacks of Gaze on turn 2 by using skill 1 and skill 2, which means she gets a stack of Contempt going on turn 3. This is actually great news for her quick damage output, as funnily enough, her skill 3-2 gets a massive damage boost when hitting an enemy with Contempt. This results in it dealing more damage against enemies with Contempt than against enemies with Gaze, which means cascading Gaze of Awe underneath Contempt can be used for tons of damage as early as turn 3. Once you do that, you start from the beginning and stack up Gaze again. These are the basics. Whenever you're in a position where you're lacking count, you can use Ryoshu's defensive skill. This is best done when the enemy has Contempt. Ryoshu's guard can inflict up to 3 bleed count against the attacker, and better yet, it's a normal guard, not a clashable one. This is an advantage, due to the abundance of unbreakable coins among enemy skill sets. Unbreakable coins consume bleed count both while clashing and when hitting after losing the clash, meaning they put heavy strain on the stack. Redirecting a skill with unbreakable coins into a defending Ryoshu both inflicts the enemy with extra count from the guard and also doesn't let the coins of that skill double dip into bleed count, helping out the stack a lot. Additionally, once you've set up 7 Gaze or Contempt on the target, Ryoshu's guard will also grant her Contempt of the Gaze, which provides her with 7 protection, making this tactic worth using and not a thinly veiled death sentence. As for additional notes on the identity in Bleed, the new Tremor type is not something you can incorporate into the team. In fact, it taking 1 bleed count on Burst only serves to hurt you. By the way, this is something you have to keep in mind, as both skill 3 versions burst hemorrhage once, meaning both of them lower bleed count on the enemy. As for the identity synergy with the ego of the same name, it's mostly contained within Ryoshu's passive. Using the ego gives 1 more Gaze on hit with Ryoshu's passive, which can come in clutch when trying to set up her skill 3-2 against multiple enemies. Namely, in the triple Pikachu wave in Refraction Railway 5 Section 1, using Contempt or the Ego will allow you to instantly stack up 9 Gaze in total on the enemy team, allowing Ryoshu to access her strongest skill on the second turn of the wave, instead of having to wait for the third. To recap, N Corp Ryoshu is a pretty good bleed identity. And I have to point this out, she's similar to Barber Otis. And Ryoshu is not necessarily worse than Barber, instead being a burstier ID that is built for fast AoE while also having some nice bleed count inflicting utility. Overall, I'd recommend you to use her on the bleed team, as she performs quite well there. Now it's Tremor's turn, and things look a lot more bleak here. On the Tremor side of things, what Ryoshu brings is a small amount of Tremor infliction, only up to 1 burst per turn, bad sin affinities, and her unique Tremor type. Let's start with the main good thing she gives, Tremor Hemorrhage. This Tremor type is effectively a 1-to-1 adaptation of Scorch from Burn to Bleed. It works in the exact same way on paper, but in practice it's simply worse. With Bleed being a status effect that runs out quickly, and with there only being 1 ID that can utilize both statuses, it's pretty much impossible to ever get value out of Hemorrhage beyond treating it as half a reverb. This might change in the future, but at least for now, the effect is literally half a reverb, which honestly is not the worst thing in the world. As for Ryoshu's Nocturne proficiency, she can only ever burst Tremor once per turn, meaning she won't be able to go ham with a triple burst into an entanglement, like many others do. Ryoshu's tremor application is nothing to write home about, but it's not exactly non-existent. And her sins? Well, they were designed to fuel Contempt awe, so it's unsurprising that they aren't great for the Tremor team. Ryoshu does not help with fueling Everlasting or Cavernous Wailing, but at least she can help with Crushbound Pest, I guess. As you can probably tell, I'm not a big fan of N Corp Ryoshu in Tremor. However, it's not like she has committed any crimes that prohibit her from being in the archetype. While she doesn't excel at anything really, and serves mostly as a way to access an additional half a reverb, she doesn't actively drag your team down. She is salvageable in the Tremor team, but not exactly a unit worth running there, due to the abundance of better options. That being said, if you still want to make use of her on that team, the gameplay loop is the same as Bleed, except her guard is effectively useless as it does not interact with Tremor at all, only with Bleed. As for Hemorrhage, I think you might want to set it up in advance, right before your nuke turn. Alternatively, you can just hold on to her skill 3 until the nuke turn comes, and hope she outspeeds other bursters with no speed control, in order to get value out of her Tremor. Overall, N Corp Ryoshu is usable in Tremor, but she is far from a meta ID there. You can't really incorporate Bleed into Tremor to make Hemorrhage pop off, and outside of the new Tremor type, Ryoshu really lacks any notable strength for this archetype. And now, it's time to look at the Fraud duo together, and figure out whether they're worth running on the same team. We'll start with why you would want to do this. And well, the reason is entirely Ryoshu's second passive. This passive allows Yi-Sang to use Ryoshu as a skill 3 target without killing her, while still getting AoE. This effect goes off when Yi-Sang uses his third skill while Ryoshu has Contempt of the Gaze and is not staggered. Target readjustment fire is turned into I shall fire anytime, which is pretty much the same skill, but it loses all of its bonuses on the first coin, and the second coin gets all boosts that it would get from killing an ally, while also having its final damage conditional changed in a way that no longer incentivizes dealing a lot of damage with the first coin. Also, the second part of her passive lets Ryoshu soften up Yi-Sang's targets whenever he is not targeting her, by using a heavily nerfed skill 1. This effect can be kinda nice, but it's overall nothing too serious. So, the first issue you will run into when trying to make use of the synergy is choosing which team to run the two in. The obvious answer seems to be Bleed, because that's where the kits of the two units overlap. But you still really don't want to use N Corp Yi-Sang on that team. He's just too bad there. Sure, you'll get to use the cool synergy at some point maybe, but you're actively making your life worse on every other turn, so it's not worth it. As for Tremor, do you really need to ask? So, this leaves us with the final option of Poise, Yi-Sang's main team of choice that has nothing to do with Ryoshu. In that team, Ryoshu does literally nothing productive except for clicking Soracalgia and then becoming the stepstone for Yi-Sang's skill 3. Is it good? Well, that definitely depends on your definition of good. I personally would just generally recommend staying away from this synergy in its entirety, as the current team building doesn't really allow Ryoshu and Yi-sang to be run together without sacrificing something. That being said, if you're gonna try your best to make it work, making it work in poise might be your best bet, as Ryoshu can help out others, especially Yi-sang, with her strong ego skill. But still, as much as the synergy looks really cool and could be powerful on paper, it does not seem practical, especially not in the Refraction Railway. And with this, my overview of N Corp Ego, Contempt or Ryoshu comes to an end. The new ID is a solid bleed unit, whom I will likely continue using on my main team. But as a Tremor ID, Ryoshu definitely falls through. Not because she's entirely unusable there, but because she is subpar in Tremor when compared to other units. As for her synergy with N Corp Yi-sang, it's not something you can use easily, and it's not a very practical combo in general, requiring you to gimp your team composition with an off-typing identity that will not do anything outside of the synergy, with the exception of Poise, where Ryoshu gets saved by having Thorakalgia. Should you get this unit? Well, pulling for her is a decision of all time, with the collab right around the corner. But sharding her is definitely a good idea for anybody interested in powering up their bleed team. Also, she looks cool as shit, so I don't really blame you for not having enough self-control. As always, if you disagree or have something to add, feel free to leave a comment below, and I might see it and respond. If you liked the video at any point, leave a like to let me know, and if you want to see more like this, consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye!